Tapping on Glass, a short horror story. Written by Stories from the Attic, narrated by McConnell. When I first told my friends about the knocking, all they did was laugh. Initially, they listened intently, nodding along and straining to hear over the rowdy shouts and clink of glasses in the pub. But as the story went on, something changed. They began, with sly smiles, to share knowing glances across the table, smirking and sighing, one or two tutting loudly, before one of them finally decided to state the obvious by announcing what the rest of them were already thinking. "We've heard this one before, mate." The speaker was Mike, one of my oldest and closest friends. He said the words whilst throwing a handful of peanuts into his mouth and washing it down with a large gulp from his drink, as if trying to stop up his mouth so that no more words would escape. Perhaps, I thought, he felt insensitive about cutting my story off so dismissively, like it was an old joke too often told. Honestly, though, he had no reason to feel bad. Not only was it a fair comment, but it was also precisely what everyone else was thinking. The story was familiar. In fact, I had also heard the story, or at least the version they expected me to tell, many times before. That first night, I could understand the laughter, though of course my story would turn out to be very different, with a far more sinister ending. Far more sinister and, tragically, far more real. In the usual version, in the story they expected me to tell, a man is woken in the night by the persistent sound of knocking, tapping, like the hard rap of knuckles against a solid surface. At first he thinks he's imagining it, but when the rapping continues, he is eventually forced, with an exasperated sigh, to throw back the blankets and leave the comfort of his bed to investigate. It can't be the front door, he thinks. Why would anyone knock when he clearly had a doorbell, especially at this hour of the night, or rather, early morning? Padding barefoot along the hall without ever bothering to switch on the light, he hears the sound again and decides to look, despite his earlier assumptions that, yes, it must be the front door. He checks his watch and sees that the time is 3:25 a.m. He approaches the door, ready to swing it open and berate whoever might be calling on him at such a stupid hour, when, instead, he hesitates. Standing before the door, he listens once again. Now there is no knocking. In fact, there is no sound at all. No sign of movement from outside, just the heavy press of silence and darkness against the wood. For the first time, our hero begins to feel uneasy. Who, he thinks to himself, would choose to call on him in the middle of the night? What sort of person was he likely to find waiting on the other side of that closed door, if indeed they were still there? Would it be more or less worrying to find someone standing there at 3 a.m.? Perhaps some hooded figure that doesn't speak but simply waits. Or perhaps no one at all. To open the door and find only a blank space with no sign that anyone had ever been there. What would he do, he thinks, if he opened the door to find nobody standing, but instead a shape at the end of the corridor, moving and crawling on all fours slowly towards him? Dismissing these ideas as stupid, he eventually works up the courage to open the door and finds, as expected, nothing. A wall of empty darkness. As he closes the door and turns back into the house, shaking his head and ready to return to bed, dismissing the whole thing as the remnants of a dream, he hears the tapping again. Tap, tap, tap. This time it comes from the window. Turning his head slowly, he looks towards it, the pane of glass covering most of the wall of the front room. He looks to the thick black drapes drawn in front of it to keep out the cold that chills the glass and seeps slowly into the room. He waits for a moment, then hears the sound again. Tap, tap, tap. Moving slowly towards the window, knowing that what he is hearing isn't possible, he stands inches from the curtains and again hesitates, terrified to pull them back, as he hears again the tap, softer now and gentler. Tap, 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 as a low female voice whispers, "Let me in, child. You have to let me in." The man turns and runs, not because the thought of a woman hunched up on his windowsill scares him, or because he is terrified by the thought of a strange visitor in the middle of the night, but because he knows he heard the voice, knows that there was and is someone on the other side of that curtain, despite the fact that our hero lives on the 27th floor. It was this same story, an old urban myth, retold in many different versions, that my other friend Davy unspooled for everyone that night in the pub when I first mentioned the knocking. "Come off it, mate," he said when he finished, jeering with a half-scoffed laugh. "We've all heard it before." I smiled in return, a weak, forced smile, one that recognized that they were probably right, that the old story was well worn and threadbare by now, that everyone had heard it, and that me repeating it came across as a weak attempt to frighten them. Still, it didn't stop the original story from being creepy, nor did it change the fact, the horrible, gnawing truth, that my version was true. I had heard the tapping, for each of the past 5 nights, a soft, gentle rapping on the glass of my windows. It didn't stop the fact that I was, frankly, terrified. I had moved into my apartment around a week before I first mentioned the knocking to my mates. Unlike the man in the old story, my apartment was only on the 11th floor, but still high enough that there should be nobody knocking at the windows. Had I lived on the ground floor, I might perhaps have dismissed the knocking as a joke. Some kids on their way home playing a practical joke. Had I been on the 3rd floor, I might still have entertained the idea. It wouldn't take much for someone to use a broom handle or 2 tied together to reach up and tap at a seemingly impossible height, freaking out the occupants before running away. But the 11th floor? Surely that was impossible. Had there been people above me, I might have suspected them. Imagined that they would lean out of their own window and tap on the glass with a long pole to freak out the new occupant below by making it seem that someone had come up to that level to knock. That would have seemed plausible, but there was no upstairs. My apartment was the top floor. The knocking should have been impossible, yet there it was, every night, around the same time. Tap, tap, tap. For the first 2 nights after I moved in, everything had been perfectly normal. The boiler had taken a while to come on and work properly because the apartment had been empty for almost 12 months, so the plumbing system hadn't been used in a while. Once I got it working, though, ran the taps and shower for a while to get any stagnant water out of the system, it seemed to be working fine. If I'm honest, there may well have been tapping on those first nights, but I wouldn't have noticed. Either I'd have been sound asleep, or I'd have assumed that it was something to do with the plumbing and gone back to sleep as soon as I heard it. It was only on the 3rd night that I noticed, and even then, only because my dog, Tito, had noticed it first. When I first got Tito, a small French bulldog with a crushed-up nose and a bark that was more of a half-strangled yelp, he had slept in his basket. My parents, who I was living with at the time, had insisted at first that the dog wasn't even allowed up the stairs. Over time, though, that changed. First, Tito made his way lazily up the stairs and began sleeping on the landing, in a spot of carpet in front of my bedroom door. Initially, I thought he'd chosen that spot out of some sense of duty or loyalty, because he wanted to protect or be close to me. I later realized that his preferred spot was the exact point that the hot water pipes ran beneath, meaning that the floor was warm, and Tito was actually just enjoying the equivalent of underfloor heating. Gradually, over the course of the next few months, I found that if I left my door open, the mangy mutt would slip into my room and sleep on the rug beside my bed. Eventually, after almost a year of slow burn stealth tactics, he found his way onto my bed, and I would let him stay, though any time my mother would catch him there she would go ballistic. Now that I was going to be living alone with Tito, and was able to make my own rules about where he was and wasn't allowed to sleep, I invited him onto the bed on the first night and intended to let him sleep there permanently, or at least until I got myself a lady friend to share the bed with instead, at which point I assumed Tito would understand. On that third night, the night the tapping started, I had been fast asleep until, in the middle of the night, I felt Tito suddenly jerk upright and stiffen. He did not bark or whine in any way as he might if someone was in the house or had knocked at the door, but he had suddenly been roused to attention, his ears, usually flat against his head, standing straight up like two little pyramids as he stared straight ahead. Rolling over, I patted the bed for him to lie down, assuming that he had been dreaming, but just as I turned, I heard it, a faint but persistent tap. At first I didn't move. The room was pitch black, with the only light being the pale green glow from my alarm clock. It cut through the dark, allowing me to make out Tito's silhouette, ears raised to attention, reflected in the wall mirrors that were attached to the cupboards along the length of one wall. When I'd sent my friends photos of the house and they'd seen this mirrored wall, there had been a lot of jokes about how I might put it to use once I got myself a girlfriend. At that moment, though, I wished the cupboards had come without mirrors, and I found myself wishing for bare wood. Staying stock still in bed, I propped myself up on my elbows. Barely breathing, holding each breath to stifle the sound, I listened to see if the noise would come again. It did. Tap, tap, tap. Without making a sound, Tito leapt from the bed and skittered out toward the living room as if that were the source of the noise. I, meanwhile, was less enthusiastic about investigating and instead decided to listen. The sound came again. For a moment I considered whether the sound might be coming from the pipes, something to do with the boiler getting back into action, but I soon decided that it wasn't the case. The sound was not metallic or muffled under layers of floorboards and brick, as the dull thud of plumbing noises tended to be. This sound was sharp, with a resonant echo behind it. It was less a tap and more of a knock. The sound, I recognized almost immediately, of knuckles against a hard surface. I instantly thought of the story, of the old woman knocking, wanting to be let in at a window 30 stories up. Tap, tap, tap. Hearing the noise again, I had to admit that it sounded far less like the rapping of a fist on wood, as it would have been if someone was knocking on the front door, than it did like the sound of tapping on glass. There was something about the echo, the way it seemed to pool around the initial sound in a low, muttered thunk, that had to be glass, but of course that was impossible. Easing myself reluctantly from the bed, I walked toward the living room. Unlike the guy in the story, however, I was sure to flip the lights on first. What I found there was Tito, sitting, his ears pricked up, tail stationary as if frozen in expectation. He was staring dead ahead, his attention fixed on the drawn curtains at the front of the house, at the front living room window. I felt my stomach tighten as the sound came again. Tap, tap, tap. It seemed gentler now, softer, as if whomever was making the sound had realized that they no longer needed to wake me, but just to bring me closer, easing and winding me in slowly, as a spider would a fly on lengths of silken thread. For almost a minute I didn't move. Instead, I remained perfectly still. Tito similarly was frozen in place by my side and had not moved a muscle since I'd entered the room. We both glared at the curtain. Was it my imagination, I thought, or was the fabric of that curtain, the fall of the material, slightly bulging outward, arcing slightly into the room as if rested gently against the shape of a figure? My mind flashed back to my childhood days, to games of hide-and-seek when I would hide from my sister by standing behind the curtain, pushing myself as far back against the wall as I could so as not to create a ripple at the front or a bulge or shape that would give me away. Looking now at the thick, cream-coloured curtains hanging heavily across the glass and covering the window that made up almost the entire front wall of the apartment, I remembered the times she had tried it, when I had found her not because she made a noise, but because there was something strange about the lay of the curtain, a crest or bump that shouldn't have been there. I checked the surface of the curtain again, noting how on one side, the left, the material lay perfectly flat, whilst on the other it seemed to yawn outward in the middle before falling away, like the gentle curve of a hill, a place where snow has blanketed the earth but cannot conceal its outline. I looked toward the ground, wondering as I did what I might do if, after allowing my gaze to drop past the length of fabric, the join and the seam, I was to see in the shadow below a pair of mouldering feet. Dead feet, the bottoms purplish-black, the skin moist and grey with cold, the seeping, buried cold of soil beneath the ground. What if those feet, bloated and swollen with moisture, were standing there with curved yellowing toenails below the shield of curtain? Even as I looked, my mind raced and scurried, darting and ferreting into corners of memory, dragging up images and ideas that I really didn't need. Facts about how the nails and hair appear to grow even after death, but how this is actually just an illusion created by the skin slowly tightening. Memories of tales by M.R. James, faces formed in crumpled linen. Finally, Tito barked and, spurred on by his action, in one swift, determined movement, I strode forward, grasped the curtain, and yanked it quickly back. Seeing the face staring back with a grimace of revulsion and terror almost gave me a heart attack. Reeling backward in an attempt to get away, I stumbled awkwardly on the rug, tripped over the dog, and fell with a heavy, tumbling thump back onto the floor. Gawping up, I stared in abject horror as I realized all at once that the face I had seen was my own. It was me, reflected in the glass. As Tito, excited by the movement and my falling over, barked furiously at the cold glass window, I shook my head and laughed. What an idiot, I thought, knowing even then that this part of the story would be missing when I related the tale to the lads in the pub. Raising myself up, I clambered to my feet just in time to hear the sound again. Tap, tap, tap. Glaring at my own reflection in the window, I again felt the ice in my belly. Yes, I had been startled, and yes, it had been stupid to be afraid of my own reflection, but that didn't change the fact that the sound had been there. It also didn't change the fact that the sound was undeniably someone tapping on glass. Now, I had a choice. For whilst I could see my own stupid self reflected in the glass, that also meant that I could see nothing outside. As long as I could see the room reflected back at me, that would be all I'd see. But if I flipped the switch, if I turned off the light and plunged the room into darkness, I would either see the building opposite, cold, still, and mundane, staring back at me, or I would see, crouched upon the window-sill, the thin and tattered form of whatever wanted to come in. The withered old hag, knees pulled up to her chest, strands of straggling hair matted to her face as she grinned, toothlessly, maniacally, perching on the window-sill and tapping upon the glass. Darkness, usually so careful to guard its secrets, would reveal everything it had to show, no matter how terrible or impossible it might be. Cautiously, I rose to my feet, leaned toward the light switch, and allowed my finger to rest upon it. The rational, adult, and logical part of my brain was screaming at me. It was reminding me how stupid it was to be afraid of the dark, how childlike and absurd my reluctance would look if anyone else could see. But, of course, there was nobody to see. Nobody there at all. That was part of the problem. If I did flip the switch, and there was something there, then I would be alone with it, in the dark. I flipped the switch. The room went black and Tito began to bark. An empty street cropped like a picture by the frame of the window. From across the street, a slate-grey building, all concrete and banality, stared directly back at me in silent, cold indifference. This is the version of the story that I'd been telling that first night, when the lads had cut me off and dismissed my story as an urban myth. When I insisted that whilst I could see the similarities, there had been a noise, they joked, that perhaps it was a pigeon tapping its beak on the window. "Or maybe an owl. After all, it was at night," cried Mike as the whole group laughed. The sequel to my story wouldn't come until a fortnight later, by which time nobody was laughing, especially Mike. The tapping had continued, though less frequently than before, and having finally convinced myself, or at least convinced myself to pretend, that it was probably a problem with the pipes, a problem that I'd eventually get a plumber to look at, I succeeded in ignoring it. Almost. The problem was Tito. Every time the tapping came, he would jolt awake and alert. On some occasions he would even sprint into the other room, expecting me to follow. Which, of course, I didn't. Because, I told myself, the whole thing was stupid, a problem with the pipes. It wasn't that I was scared, I'd tell myself. It was just stupid, that's all. So I stayed in bed and let Tito pursue the sound himself. Part of me wishes now that I had followed him, but another part is glad and grateful that I didn't. One night, around 2 weeks after I'd first told my friends about the knocking, the sound came again, and, to me, seemed louder than ever. Right on cue, Tito had his usual reaction, stiffening up and rising to attention before leaping from the bed and scrambling into the other room in pursuit of someone who I told myself wasn't there. Whilst I had no intention of following the daft mutt into the living room, his actions had woken me up, alerting me to the fact that my bladder was full and that, despite my best efforts to ignore that quirk of the plumbing, I would be forced to get out of bed and take myself off for a pee. Having done what was necessary, I began making my way back to the bedroom and called to Tito, expecting him to come snuffling obediently behind me. But Tito never came. When I called again, he didn't come. I reasoned that he must have become fixated on something in the other room. Stupid dog, I remember thinking as images of him pulling over the lamps or attacking the curtains forced me to turn around and shuffle in my boxer shorts, slowly back toward the living room, where Tito would no doubt be growling at the sofa or some other imagined horror. Only he wasn't there growling, because Tito was no longer there. I called him and checked behind the sofa and in the other rooms, convinced that he hadn't passed me on the way. I went back to the bedroom, opened the cupboards, and then made my way back to the living room, but he was nowhere to be found. After a few minutes of desperate searching, calling his name and looking in the most ridiculous of places, I began to panic. I looked inside cupboards he couldn't have opened, in the barrel of the washing machine, and even in the fridge in case he had somehow managed to crawl inside. After about an hour, I was not only panicking, but questioning my own sanity. The doors were locked, the windows were closed and bolted. He had to be somewhere in the apartment. He had to be, and yet he wasn't. I checked the exits again, even pulling up bits of carpet to make sure he hadn't burrowed through gaps in the floorboards. Still, there was no sign. Tito had vanished. As you might imagine, I didn't sleep at all that night. The following morning, I called my landlord and told him I wanted to get out of the arrangement. Since I had made the arrangements through a friend, moved in early, and hadn't actually signed the contracts, he was surprisingly okay with it, so long as I covered the next month's rent whilst he found someone to replace me. That night I met my friends in the pub, including Mike, who had originally hooked me up with the landlord, and told them what had happened to Tito. This time, nobody laughed. Whilst they found the situation hard to believe, one of them insisting over and over that I must have left a window open, they all realized how devastating the loss was for me, however it had come about. One said that the setup reminded him of an Edgar Allan Poe story, or was it Sherlock Holmes? How could the dog have escaped from a totally sealed room? He mused. Oddly, even then, I doubted that Tito had escaped. If he'd got out, if he had somehow, like the Houdini of canines, managed to push open a locked door or window and then seal it up again from the inside, then fine. But what then? Dogs, especially dogs like Tito, don't just take themselves on wanders never to return. Most of the time they come back to familiar ground, back to where their owners live, or the last place they remember being. Tito hadn't come back, but then I had no explanation for where he might have gone in the first place, until I spoke with Mike. Particularly quiet throughout the conversation and for the rest of the night, Mike had seemed out of sorts from the moment I mentioned Tito, and, unusually for him, had even gone home early, saying that he felt under the weather and that he would call us the next day. He did call me, though it wasn't to arrange a meet-up. Over the phone, Mike told me about the woman who had lived in the apartment before me. It was through him and his previous job working as an estate agent that I had got the flat in the first place.
"Thing is,"
he said, his voice a low, croaking whisper,
"the woman who was there before, she went a bit mental."
Jesus, I thought. Here comes the creepy ghost story about the previous tenant being some kind of axe murderer who came back to haunt the place. I suggested this to Mike and tried to laugh the idea off, but Mike was having none of it. He was deadly serious.
"It isn't like that, mate,"
he muttered solemnly.
"This woman, she went a bit mad after her daughter went missing. Thing is, about a month before her daughter vanished, she told Garrett, your landlord, that her dog had gone missing as well, from a locked house.
I felt the hair on my neck stand on end.
I mean, we all thought she was mad, but she swore that the dog had been left in all day with all the doors and windows shut, just like you and Tito. She said there was no way it could have got out, so somebody must have been in the apartment. She made Garrett change all the locks and everything.
What? I bawled down the phone. And you never bothered to tell me this? There was a pause.
I didn't want to freak you out. I mean, you don't believe in that mumbo-jumbo, so I didn't think it would have bothered you anyway. It was only when you started talking about the knocking that I felt weird, but I didn't want to scare you. You know, put daft ideas in your head.
What kind of ideas? I asked before adding tentatively, What happened to her daughter, Mike? There was a long pause, and for a second I wondered if Mike was even still there. Then he spoke.
You see, now, that's the thing.
He began.
According to her story, it was the same as the dog. The kid vanished from the apartment, even though all the doors and windows were locked, with brand new locks too. Difference was, this time, she saw what happened.
Mike paused, as if considering for a moment whether to go on with the story, before suddenly deciding to go all in and tell me.
It was the knocking, you see. She'd heard it just like you said, right in the middle of the night, like a hand knocking on glass. She'd gotten out of bed and walked into the living room to check, but there was nobody there. She opened the door, checked the front window. Nothing. So she turned around and went back to her room, but as she did, she stuck her head into her daughter's room, just to check on her, you know.
I said that I knew what he meant.
She said that when she looked in, her daughter was sitting up on the edge of her bed. At first she wondered what the hell she was doing and thought maybe she'd been the one tapping on the windows. But as she looked in, she realized the sound wasn't someone tapping on the window. They were tapping on the mirror. Tapping on it. From the other side.
Again, Mike paused. His voice had begun to shake and crack as he spoke, but he coughed to clear his throat and continued.
The woman said that as she looked, she could see her daughter sitting there, and opposite, in the upright mirror, attached to the cupboard door, she could see the reflection. The girl and the room, but that wasn't all. She said that in the reflection there was something else. She said it was tall. Well, she called it a stretched person. Twig thin, with everything too long. She said it had no features, but it was dark, like a shadow, and it was knocking, slowly, rapping on the glass with these thin, big, knuckly hands, knocking to get the girl to come. She said that she screamed, but before she could move forward to scoop up her daughter and carry her away, it had her. A hand, leathery brown and massive, covered in curls of coarse black hair, reached out through the mirror. She said it gripped her daughter by the top of the head, that it had talons, and they clamped on the skull like one of those claw games you play in arcades, trying to win a soft toy. She said that she rushed forward, but it pulled and yanked the girl, lifting her off the bed, across the room and up against the mirror, then through it, to God knows where.
I didn't know what to say.
They never found the girl. She was reported missing, and for a while they wanted to charge the mum, but without a body to speak of and no real evidence of a crime, what could they charge her with? She ended up being committed because she wouldn't stop screaming about the thing in the mirror and the mirror people, saying that she could hear them knocking all the time, wanting to be let in. She said that they come to the mirrors to look in on us, to hunt us, the way we look into the surface of water for fish. Creatures that never know until it's too late about the world outside the water, on the other side of the surface. She said they'd snatched her dog as well, dragged it through the mirror and ate it, but I don't know how she knew that part. Anyway, I didn't tell you because you had a good deal. I didn't want to put you off and...
He trailed off before adding finally.
Poor Tito.
Yeah, I said in response. Poor Tito. I never found out what happened to my dog. A week after my chat with Mike, I moved into a ground-floor apartment. It has 2 bedrooms, a large living room, and not a single mirror. This has been Tapping on Glass, a short horror story, written by Stories from the Attic, narrated by Robin McConnell, copyright 2023 by Michael van der Voort, production copyright by Michael van der Voort.